Welcome to Clocked In, the podcast where work works for people, not the other way around. We're Kristen and Ashley, and every week we dive into what's really going on in today's workplaces. From hybrid headaches to hiring trends, culture clashes to quiet quitting. Whether you're an HR pro, a people manager, or just someone trying to make sense of your 9 to 5, we've got the conversations that matter and the strategies to help you build a better workplace. So grab your coffee, clock in, and let's get to work. Welcome to this week's episode of Clocked In. We're going to be talking about Gen Z some more. This is episode 2 of our 4-part series on Gen Z. We're your hosts. I'm Ashley.
And I'm Kristen. And like Ashley said, today we're going to continue talking about Gen Z and the potential challenges that you may face when working with them. But just as a brief overview, Generation Z or Gen Z are people born between 1997 and 2012, and they have a really bad reputation in the workplace currently. So they're often labeled as being difficult or hard to work with. And according to Resume Builder, actually nearly 3 in 4 managers believe Gen Z is more difficult to work with than any other generation. And according to another poll, 38% of employers avoid hiring recent college graduates. And I think that we actually have a short video that kind of highlights some of the frustrations that are going on with Gen Z in the workplace.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for joining. Are you ready to get started, or do you want a minute to finish your vape?
No, I'm fine. We can go.
Right. Okay. So can you tell me a bit about yourself and why you're interested in this role?
I am a highly motivated, results-driven professional who excels in a fast-paced, synergetic environment with a passion for leveraging dynamic cross-functional collaboration.
Good. That's a great answer. Did ChatGPT write that?
No, I wrote it. I say that all the time.
Oh, okay. Can you give me an example of a time that you handled a conflict at work?
My old manager hated me and was mean to me for literally no reason every day, so I had to deal with that.
Okay, right. I'm really sorry to hear that. What would you say is your biggest weakness?
Probably my attachment style, but I'm in therapy for that.
Okay, any professional weaknesses?
I can't work Tuesdays or Fridays and some mornings.
Okay, so we're gonna...
Mom, stop. I know what I'm doing.
Is everything okay?
She keeps sending me shit. God, I'm obviously good at interviews.
Okay, yes. Okay, well, we're gonna be in touch. Thank you.
I was dying at the what's your biggest professional weakness? I can't work, Tuesdays or Fridays. I want to be same. That's what I want my weakness to be. Sorry, I can't work any days during the week.
Or some mornings.
Yeah, bare minimum Mondays, as I like to call it. So, oh my gosh. Okay. So obviously that video highlighted a lot of the challenges that are perceived of this generation. And obviously that was kind of a spoof, a funny take on it. But whenever I see these videos, it's clearly enough of these instances have come up that someone is making a video about it, right? So good and bad about stereotypes. Obviously, you have to be careful about them because you can't apply them to everybody. But again, most cases, of course, there's been enough cases of something that come up that a generation becomes known for them. And so Gen Z, unfortunately, has some pretty negative traits that they are known for. And so we're going to talk about those today and really talk about how maybe they're not so much weaknesses or how you can adapt to them, both from a perspective of the employer side, as well as if you are a Gen Z employee or a recent graduate about to enter the workforce, what you can do knowing that these perceptions exist. So Ashley, do you want to dive on into maybe a couple of these common complaints that people have about Gen Z?
Absolutely. I think it's so important that we talk about these because by 2030, it's estimated that Gen Z will make up about 30% of the workforce. So these issues are challenges that are going to be prevalent, if they're not already prevalent, in your organization for the foreseeable future. So some of the common complaints that are made about Gen Z is, one, their over-reliance on technology. We talked in the last episode about them being digital natives and how that really just means they're familiar and comfortable with the internet. but they're also perceived as being unable to function without a smartphone or social media. I know there has been research in this area with like addiction to technology even, but this is a common complaint that is probably very true, to be honest, about this generation. Bad. And so I think especially if Gen Z has that less amount of work experience that they're starting their career with, this is something that expectations will just need to be really clear about what is professional in the workplace. And even if you think I shouldn't have to say that, you might have to say that, right? Like you might have to tell somebody you need to take your AirPods out if you're talking to a customer, or you need to not be on your phone when a client is right in front of you trying to have a conversation. And so I know those kind of seem like comical examples, but they're things I've seen happen in the workplace multiple times.
Yeah. And I think like I'm laughing at the examples that you're giving, but I have witnessed those firsthand. I was thinking about the time when literally I was doing grocery pickup, which is my favorite thing in the world, is that now they have curbside for groceries. But the person that brought it out, usually they're great. They'll have a little conversation with you. This person had not only their AirPods in, but they were having a whole other telephone conversation with their significant other that was like not going well. It was not a pleasant conversation that they were having. And I kind of wanted to chime in and give like some relationship advice since they were making it so open while they're putting my groceries in my car, to be like, if you have this attachment, you know, she said, my attachment style, like their attachment style was not positive from this conversation. And so it's just crazy to me, like this over reliance and almost like addiction to technology it's a problem, I think. So this one, if we're talking about fact or fiction, I think I'm saying this one's fact from what I've seen.
I think about a couple of weeks ago, I went up to a counter to order something and the worker was on their phone, like with their headphones in, having a full conversation. So I'm waiting because I'm like, oh, you're not ready to help me. And then it's like, what do you want? And I was like, oh my gosh, like I was trying to let you finish your conversation that I'm thinking apparently was more important than the job. But prime example, over-reliance on technology, maybe to the extreme there, but it does kind of call out the need for expectations to be set and to be communicated clearly, even if it seems like it should be understood that you are not having a conversation on the phone when you're supposed to be taking orders. Maybe not so much, right?
Yeah. And before we move on to the next one, just something that I saw recently talking about social media and technology is, you know, now some schools are banning, like high schools and middle schools are banning cell phones completely, which I can see why they would do that. But, and also some of the concerns from parents around it as well. But one teacher I thought did something that was so smart, and she took to social media and she was asking for examples in the workplace of when you cannot have your phone. And she's like, I want to make the connection of like, this is why it's not so bad, and this is why it's going to help you in the future. And so I was reading some of the comments. I gave, you know, one of my own because in corporate, sometimes like when you're talking about customer service, you should not be on your phone in that case. But also sometimes if you're dealing with sensitive customer data, for example, like certain departments are not allowed to have their phone out at all. And if you have it out, you will get fired. So it's not just a matter of, you know, just put it away for the sake of putting it away. There's sometimes real legit reasons as to why you cannot be on your cell phone. And so I thought that was such a brilliant move on her part to make that connection. But going back to what you just said, is sometimes it seems so obvious. Do not be on your cell phone when you are supposed to be assisting a customer, but there's a disconnect there because they have grown up with their phone. It's like second nature to them. Anyways, we could talk all day probably about that, but what is the second one on the list?
The second kind of common misconception, maybe, or complaint that we hear a lot about Gen Z is their poor face-to-face communication skills. They prefer to text over being on the phone. And as a millennial, I think sometimes I prefer to text versus making a phone call. I love it when you can schedule an appointment online and not have to call someone and get that set up that way. So this one I see as kind of could be a positive, could be a negative, right? So if you are unable to communicate face to face, that's a problem. But in certain situations, I don't think it's necessarily bad to prefer a quicker form of communication versus face to face. But I think the key here is knowing what's appropriate when. And this is something that I try to really help my students understand, is that sometimes what's appropriate for a text or an IM, kind of a Slack message, is different than what needs to be in an email versus what needs to be a phone call versus what needs to be a face to face conversation. And so helping students see that, hey, you can't just pick the one that you want to do. Like, you need to make an informed decision on the best way to communicate information. And so managers need to help those younger employees see that too. So what situations are fine for a Slack message or a Teams message? What actually would be better to have a face-to-face conversation around? Recognizing that just because you want to send the quick message doesn't mean that's the right way to communicate that message. And so I think because of the technology dependence, this generation kind of gets that rap for, oh, they don't know how to communicate face-to-face. And I have seen this, unfortunately, like even in classes where students won't talk to the people next to them because they'd just rather be on their phone. Or they don't know how to have an uncomfortable conversation because they're used to just ghosting somebody if they don't want to talk to them anymore. And so I think this poor communication skills on the face-to-face front can go either way on terms of whether that's fact or fiction. But what do you think, Kristen?
Yeah, so I was laughing because just this week I was again in a combined meeting and students were presenting from a student organization, and they did a phenomenal job. They did a really, really great job. But then at the end, they were sharing their contact information in case students had other questions or wanted to join. The one, I think he was maybe the president of the group, he got up there and said, here's our phone number. And he said, but I don't like talking on the phone, so please don't call me. He was like, come by or send me an email and we'll get back to you. But he was like, yeah, don't call me. And I have to agree, like, I'm not a phone person. Like, some, like my sister, she'll spend all day talking to you on the phone. I just am not like that. But I think where the problem is, it leads to like a lack of social skills in general, and it can lead to some unprofessionalism in the workplace, like we were just talking about, in the sense of like, because they're only used to talking through text or through their electronics, they can't have a face-to-face conversation with one another. And so I think, to your point, it's really important to kind of note, like, this may have to be taught. And we definitely are trying to incorporate that into some of my classes of like a bunch of group work, talk to your neighbor, come in and like network with the people that are around you versus just being on your phone. And I agree. I think that this one is true in some regards, but to me, this one is not as extreme as maybe what some of the other ones are, because I've certainly seen a number of cases where students are willing to have a conversation with you, or they'll just stop by to talk to you about random things that aren't related to the class. And so some of this may be based on personality, but I think that for some people who are maybe more inclined to not have conversations, this over reliance on technology is making that even worse because they don't have to. And so I think just understanding that if there is like unprofessional behaviors that are showing themselves in the workplace, or if a Gen Z worker is only wanting to email you versus have a meeting face to face, it's your responsibility as a manager to say, hey, let's meet about this instead of emailing. Or if you see, I've been stuck on, I'm sure you have as well, especially when I was working on the corporate side, those email chains that just keep going and going and going. And sometimes they're getting escalated where you're just like, let's push pause, and this is a time for a phone call or a meeting. I think that's really important as well to carry on to the workplace. So I agree with you. I think this is 50-50, depending on the situation or fiction.
I was just thinking about your point about personality, that I have some students who would much rather have a Zoom meeting or a phone call to discuss something. And afterwards, I think, wow, that really could have been an email. But they just preferred to have the conversation, and sometimes people just want to be heard. And so I think that there is some nuance here on whether or not that poor face-to-face communication skills is like dampening their ability to be productive or communicate effectively in the workforce. Which moves us to our next point, another common kind of phrase you hear a lot about younger people, Gen Z, is that they have unrealistic expectations. And so they often are said that they want those immediate promotions, they're looking for high salaries, they want perfect work-life balance early in their career, and often don't want to work beyond what their set hours are, but they want that instant flexibility. And so I think for this one, I think it really depends on the realities of what that student has experienced before. And this is where I think having previous work experience does make a difference, even if it's a part-time, fast food kind of environment, not necessarily a career role, but for people to see what is it actually like to be in the workplace. What are those standards of behaviors? What does it mean to be professional? And knowing that sometimes there are trade-offs. Like sometimes there is a big project that it is all hands on deck and it's going to spill past 5 o'clock. And that's different than, the boss is texting you at 3 a.m. and expecting a response, and you have to be on your phone at midnight as well. And like, those are not the same thing, right? So an occasional after hours project is different than a culture that's built around always being available and there is no work-life balance. It's just all about work and all those sorts of things. And so I think if you don't have the work experience, it's easy to have unrealistic expectations. Likewise, if people have never kind of like held you to the standard of this is what it means to be professional, this is what the workplace is like here, and if you want to work here, this is what we expect from our employees, it does sometimes kind of have these unrealistic expectations where people don't really know what they don't know, or they get this idea in their head because they saw someone who's 2 decades into their career able to make certain decisions or prioritize certain things because they've built up that reputation and that skill set that a 20-year-old doesn't have. Have you seen anything like this in the workplace, Kristen?
So I would say I'm probably, and it depends on this one, if we're talking about this being fact or fiction. And I was thinking about like when I first entered the workforce, it was like you kind of had to earn that flexibility, like it was this concept of I know I may have to put in more hours now because I need to prove myself, I guess is a better way to put it. And there was just thought that like when you enter into the workforce, you're going to have to prove yourself. And I have seen, which I think kind of gets to our next point, so I don't want to get too far ahead, but just like they don't think that they have to like prove themselves sometimes, that just because they're there that that's going to get them to where they need to be. I most definitely, which I think could be a positive or not, have seen like when a class time ends, and it's, I guess also like while I'm thinking about it, it's important to say like I see it on the spectrum as well, and it kind of seems to go in groups. So like the older students, maybe because they've been through college, don't necessarily behave this way, but now when I'm seeing like the true freshmen come in, there is a vast difference in how those two groups behave, but they're all part of the same generation. So I think that's worth noting as well. But for example, like when I was reading about like the work-life balance and I thought like I am leaving right on the dot at 5 o'clock, that can be healthy. That can be, if you're looking at avoiding burnout and stuff like that, that can absolutely be healthy as an individual. But sometimes there are times when you have to put in that extra work just because it requires it. And again, like we'll have sometimes these combined classes, and I honestly, I don't know who the student is, but about 5 minutes till, sometimes even 10 minutes till, she will just stand up, get her stuff, and then just like stand there and be like, the time is ending and I am walking out no matter where the speaker is in their presentation. And I understand, I am sure she has another class that she has to get to, but I think we were talking about this as well. Like if that happened when I was in school and my professor went late, I just was going to be late to the next class until the next professor, I'm so sorry, my class went over. And so I have seen that more and more often, and I've overheard other professors talking about it as well, of like, they'll just start packing up their stuff and get up and leave, whether you're done or not. And that is truly astonishing to me. I don't know where that comes from. I have a lot of like thoughts of just maybe the respect that's not there that it is being displayed, but I don't know. So I definitely can see how this would translate to the workplace of like my time versus your time, and I'm not going to let there be an overlap in between.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. And like that's going to cause friction in the workplace for sure. And so, we talked about like that values alignment that Gen Z wants out of their jobs. And it's like sometimes I think this generation is less likely to want to pay their dues, and like they don't want to kind of earn those privileges that come with proving yourself, that flexibility, that ability to work a different shift or whatever, that may be, like to kind of flex your time a little bit, but to realize that some of those expectations are unrealistic. And if they're not pushed back against, then they're going to just be taking those unrealistic expectations to every job and thinking, well, it's the company's fault, right? Like they're not giving me what I want, or I got to protect my peace. I got to not get burned out, and I've got to keep with these very strict kind of standards so that I don't work too much because I want time for my life. And so I don't think work-life balance is bad, and every generation I think wants that in some degree. It's just kind of maybe called a different thing, but these unrealistic expectations really can be a problem in the workplace. And I think that I would vote this one as fact. I see this more often than not. Not so much on the salary piece, at least in the students I talk to. I think a lot of them have more of like reasonable expectations on a starting salary, but the expecting like, I need a growth path. I need to know where my future is here or else I can't stay. And, a lot of research around job hopping with millennials, and I think it'll carry over into Gen Z as well. But yeah, that refusal to work beyond the set hours, I think, is something that is really going to impact managers and organizations as they think about recruiting and retaining Gen Z. And that takes us to our next kind of common complaint that's said a lot about this generation, and that's their entitled attitude. So expecting things to be handed to them rather than earning them, which we talked a lot about with the last point as well. But I think this entitled attitude can sometimes come out in like a difficulty adapting to a more traditional hierarchy that might exist in an organization. So the fact that there are levels of an organization, of management, etc., may be very challenging for this generation, especially if they are looking for their opinions and insights to be valued right out of the gate. And so this is something that I know I've seen in individuals where, and it goes back to that paying your dues mentality of, well, your boss is probably not going to ask your insights or your opinions on every decision that gets made. Sometimes there might be group collaboration or a team discussion about things, but you don't get to speak into every decision that your boss makes. And I've seen that amongst Gen Z workers as well, that can be a challenge. Like, my opinion's not valued, my insights aren't valued. And it's like, you haven't been here. Somebody I used to work with would make a comment, you haven't been here long enough to have an opinion. And I don't think, you can have an opinion whether it's right or wrong, but the premise remains the same, that like, you don't have enough insight into maybe a broader department or this organization strategy or whatever. You're more of an individual contributor. That's not a bad role. That's where you are right now. And there's ways that you can show that you're ready for more and want to do more, but you're not entitled to be a key decision maker from day one of joining a company.
Yeah, and I think we were kind of talking about this earlier as well. So from like a student perspective, I am often shocked at the directness in which they ask for something. And I guess, like, to preface it, like, I am very conflict averse. So a lot of times it's like I would never go out of my way to ask for something, even if it's okay to ask. And I think that may be an actual strength of this generation, is that if they see something or they think something should be different, they will ask for it. I think where the problem lies is how they ask for it, because it is the same of, well, I'm going to ask for it and you should just give it to me because I'm asking you for it. So it can be as simple as, I want to redo this assignment. Well, no, you can't just redo things every time you want to redo them. I've had like, I don't like this type of test question. Can we not have this test question anymore? No. So it's surprising. So even like the things that they're asking for, they're not bad and they're not wrong. And I think it is a positive that they are willing to ask and speak their mind. I think that is a great strength that they have. Again, I think it just is, and I don't know if this is a sense of entitlement that just like people should listen to me and my opinion matters. And so I'm just going to throw it out there and it should be what it is. But I think if they just focus on their professionalism and how they're bringing something up and how they're asking for it, that could change the game for this generation and really start to leverage the strength of not being afraid to ask for something or not being afraid to bring their opinion up. If they could get their approach down, it could be a really great strength for them.
Absolutely. And I think there's a big difference between demanding something and not being afraid to ask for something. And like how that message gets delivered is going to make an impact in how it's perceived. Right? Now, the answer may still be no, like to your, can we not have this kind of question? Like, no, like that's your decision as the professor. But there's a different way to say that than this kind of question shouldn't be included for these reasons. Like that professionalism in how you deliver a message is an important skill. And I think you're right. Like this can be a positive if it's used correctly, in the right way, in the right timing. You know, like, are you putting somebody on blast in a meeting or are you talking to them one-on-one? Very different approaches in how you are going to be perceived and that attitude behind it. But that does tie into the last kind of common complaint or criticism of Gen Z, which is the need for constant feedback and praise. So this generation requires more recognition and validation than previous generations, is the idea. I've seen this in some ways where it's this, I got a trophy because I participated, kind of mentality, but also just the expectation that there should be more ongoing conversations around performance, and especially on the positive side, right? Like if you have negative things to say, then I don't really care about that as much, kind of is the vibe I get sometimes. But like this desire for praise, and we all want to know, like, if you're doing a good job, are you meeting expectations? And I think that this kind of highlights that you can't just have a once a year annual performance review and that's the only time that you give feedback to employees. But knowing that this generation is more expectant of validation and like praise for their work. And so I think about in the workplace how just saying, well, I'll let you know if you're doing something wrong and how to correct it isn't the same as giving positive feedback too. So like feedback shouldn't just be negative or just be constructive, but they're looking for both kinds, and especially the praise piece is missing. So what have you seen, Kristen?
Honestly, like I'm kind of perplexed about this one because I definitely can see like the participation trophy kind of scenario of like, well, I showed up, I did the work, and then I've seen where students in general are kind of surprised if their grade isn't what they thought that it would be, just because they're like, well, I turned it in, so why isn't my grade higher? And so I've seen that part of it, but I've also seen like maybe experience the opposite. If they're wanting the feedback, they're not asking for it, if that makes sense. Like if I give feedback on a paper or if somebody gets a grade that they don't like they're not necessarily coming and asking like, well, how can I do better? Or how can I grow? And so it was interesting to me that when they're known as the achievement kind of oriented generation and that they crave this feedback and recognition, because I feel like they're not asking for it, and maybe it's just like an unspoken expectation of theirs that you give it to them. So that was very insightful to me because I don't know. I would just think that like if I am doing something, like my natural reaction would be like, what worked well? What can I improve on? And like asking for that feedback sometimes. But when I was reading that, I thought from a manager perspective, they may not ask for it. I don't even know if they know to ask for it. But if this is something that's important to them, then it's important to call it out and recognize their positive behaviors and kind of that feed forward type of approach. And so I do think that the ones who truly ask for it, I think that they're very open and they're very receptive to feedback. I've had several students on the flip side who have said, I've never gotten feedback about this type of work before. Like, can you give me more to help me grow? And so I think that they respond very well to that. But as you were describing it, I was thinking about, my son is 6 years old and he can get into this habit of if he does something good, he's like, well, what did I earn? What did I earn for it? And so now, like, we're having to kind of like backtrack that, because you want to reward good behavior. But at the same time, if knowing that they're so achievement oriented, it can't be like, well, every time you do a good project, you're going to get a raise, So I think there's like, I don't know offhand like what that right balance would be, but as you were describing it, I was thinking of that scenario and how it could easily see that in the workplace of like, I need that validation, I need that praise, I need that reward. And if you go too far with it, that could just create well, every time I do something, then I'm going to be promoted. And I have seen that in the workplace. I don't necessarily, it might have just been like the culture of the organization because I don't think there was a number of Gen Z employees there at the time, but it just was this expectation that like, well, if I do any good sort of work, I'm just going to get promoted. And that's not always the case, nor should it be the case in an organization. But yeah, that's kind of like where my thought went on that one. I find that one to be maybe the most interesting one on the list, to be honest with you.
And something I've seen kind of change over time of teaching college classes is I've just noticed this more recently, like at a much higher rate, of this expectation of when a student maybe doesn't get the grade they want and their response is, but I worked really hard, or I put a lot of time into this and my grade doesn't reflect that. And it's like, sure, some projects, some tasks, whether at work or in school, are going to take a lot of time to do them. But just because you spend a lot of time on it, if your output isn't good, you're not going to do well. You're not going to get the good grade. You're not going to get that feedback or that praise. And so this idea that, but I worked really hard, so my grade should match that, or so the praise, the feedback should match that. It's almost like it's a disconnect between the input of what you do work-wise, but also the quality of the output. So you could spend a lot of time, but if you answer the question wrong, you're not going to get a good grade. You could spend a lot of time working on a project at work, but if you miss the point of what the client really cared about, they're not going to be pleased. And so I think this kind of highlights that as well with your story about your son, just that there is this kind of balance that is needed. And so just because somebody wants feedback or praise doesn't mean it always has to look the same way or have to look, in the same like the bonus or a raise or a promotion. Like maybe it's just a check-in and it's like, hey, I noticed that you were working really hard on this. Thanks for your contributions. Thanks for, being a team player. Thanks for, like a thank you goes a long way too.
I just was thinking like, sometimes like to your point, like I'll have to tell him, sometimes you just have to do a good job because that's what's expected of you. And that's what you are supposed to be doing. And so then, like you said, it's that balance of, what do you do? What do you not do? And then, how do you reward them appropriately and acknowledge them without it being like exactly like you said, a thank you can have a huge impact on somebody.
Everybody wants to feel like seen at work, like their work really matters. And so like when your manager calls it out, recognizes what you're doing, you're not just another cog in the wheel, so to speak, but you're like actually a contributing member of a team that's helping achieve these goals or things like that. So yeah, I think this was an interesting one for sure on Gen Z. And I think we mentioned this in the last episode too, but none of these things we talk about are going to be true for every single Gen Z person, like just because they were born within a certain time frame. But that this generation is facing a lot of criticism. But every other generation did as well from the preceding generations. But I do think it's worth noting some of these things because they do reflect maybe some broader societal changes. They also represent just different kind of characteristics or qualities in the generation. And there are things that managers can do to help overcome these. There's opportunities for conversations and feedback but also knowing that this is the reality of the workers that are coming in, and that's not an excuse. Both things can be true. This can be standard for the generation, and it's okay to hold your workers to a higher standard. It's okay to teach them about professionalism and things like that. And so listeners, we want to hear from you. What's been your biggest surprise, either positive or negative, working with Gen Z? So let us know in the comments. And also, we have a freebie for you if you are interested in learning how to manage Gen Z without losing your mind. We have a free quick start guide that you can access using the link below in the show notes. And that wraps up today's episode, which was the second in our 4-part series about Gen Z in the workplace. If you found this helpful, be sure to subscribe, to share the show, leave a review. You can follow us on Instagram or LinkedIn. And don't forget to grab your Managing Gen Z Without Losing Your Mind free guide. We're clocking out, and we'll see you next time.